In a different studio. I think next week, or possibly the week thereafter, we will be back to a newly renovated CCTV Be Live studio, which, of course, we here are all very excited about. If anybody wants to give me a call tonight, of course, you're always welcome. The number is 617-401-4094. Again, 617-401-4094. Yesterday I was down at the State House, and it's always interesting to go to the State House and to engage in civic action. This is where laws are made. This is where our lives are very much influenced and controlled, you might say. So it's always good to get involved, and I think it's a lot better than sitting around and complaining. And of course, I think, as I've always said, that the art or the practice of governance is always rather messy. And I think sometimes people, particularly members of the public, have this idea that we're going to somehow get political leaders that are incorruptible and terribly wise and somehow much better than we ourselves are. And I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think that laws are going to be made somehow by some perfectly fair, perfectly transparent way. So I think it's just a mess. It's always been a mess, and it will always be a mess. I think all you can do is hope to improve things a little. And usually that takes a lot of work, and sometimes it takes courage. And yesterday there was a meeting in front of the, I guess you would call it the Joint Department, of the Joint Committee on Revenue. And there is a bill that is being proposed sponsored by a representative of the state to remove the excise tax from a package of cigarettes. And of course, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights has been working along with Jeffrey Yalenezian of Brennan smoke shops. There are, I think, 7 of them, to remove this sales tax, which is really kind of adding insult to injury, in that the total excise taxes on a package of cigarettes are over $5, and then when one goes to the store to buy them, the retailer is obligated to add a 6.25% sales tax on top of that. So it's a tax that not only is calculated on another tax, so it is double dipping, you might call it, and it is very, very excessive. And we did not hear about this meeting until about 9 p.m. On, I guess it was, today is Wednesday, 9 p.m. on Monday. But fortunately, we were able, Geoff and a man who is working for him as a lobbyist by the name of Guy Glodis, and I were able to be down there and testify in favor of this. And it was not a very crowded hearing, and I was happily surprised that the members of the Joint Committee did indeed pay attention to us and were very polite. And we did have a Cambridge City Councilor down there, Tim Toomey, who is also a state representative. So I guess he collects 2 salaries from the state, which is perfectly legal, I guess. And so I was interested also in the testimony of a state rep down there who is in favor of raising the excise tax on alcohol and creating a fund to treat people who have alcohol addiction, which, of course, unlike tobacco addiction, if you want to call it addiction, can lead to severe accidents, misbehaviors like beating up your spouse, failure to show up for your work on time, and even overdosing. None of those, of course, is ever present with with tobacco. I mean, people don't who smoke, they call it an addiction, but it's never an addiction that interferes with one's daily life. In fact, as we've noted on this program many times, it helps people concentrate, it helps people overcome their anxiety and depression, speeds their reaction time. So it's very, very different than alcohol. But this particular state representative, whose last name is Khan, she noted that the excise tax on alcohol has not been raised since 1979. Now, I don't know if she's referring to the state excise tax on alcohol or the federal excise tax, and I'm not even sure if there is both a state and a federal excise tax on alcohol. I believe there is, so the 1979 figure is probably the state excise tax. And Jeffrey brought up the fact that, of course, the tobacco excise tax is raised almost every year in Massachusetts and in other states. In fact, Massachusetts has the second highest excise tax on tobacco in the country after New York. And I think one of the reasons, of course, that the state excise tax is not raised on alcohol is because about 80% of the public drinks alcohol. So they are against taxation. And I mean, we always criticize politicians for not acting fairly and for not spreading taxes equally among the population. But if you look at the public itself, the public is very happy to tax people who smoke an egregious amount and thereby relieve any pressure to tax them. So I think this is kind of indicts the public in a sense that people here in this state can countenance the fact that a minority of its citizens are paying a tremendously high tax. And we have a lot of libertarians, we have a lot of Republicans, we have a lot of Democrats who always talk about fair taxation, etc., yet they all seem very willing to pick the pockets of us smokers and people who use tobacco, and they don't seem to care very much about it. But, well, we're going to try to get this on the ballot, and we are going to try to show them that they cannot ignore us, that they're either going to have to say openly, we don't care about fair taxation policy, or they're going to have to vote down this tax. And I am not terribly optimistic, but at the same time, I spoke to this state representative, Ms. Khan, and I explained to her how high the tax is on tobacco relative to alcohol, and she seemed to be sympathetic to that, even or especially when, as we've pointed out before, you consider that that people who use tobacco tend to be disproportionately lower income. Therefore, this tax is not only a regressive tax, which is defined as a tax which takes a bigger bite out of poorer people than rich people, but it is a tax that it seems almost aimed, almost targeted at a minority who does have a less political power and is, simply because of its lower income status, less likely to be able to influence legislative bodies. So we think the hearing went very well, and Guy Glotis, the lobbyist, thinks that it will get out of committee and possibly in front of the state legislature, in which case then there will be debate on it, and Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights and other persons who, again, might be interested in equitable taxation and also might disagree with the idea that taxes are a club for which the government can modify the behavior of the citizenry, can speak their piece. And And that's an interesting idea itself. I mean, because the whole American idea was that the government was supposed to be the servant of the people. But now it seems more and more that the government or people in government think it is their mission to modify the behavior of the citizenry, which has which has certainly been a complete reversal since the whole American experiment began with the American Revolution, where the citizen was sovereign. The citizen was the person to whom, as John Locke said, unless his behavior directly hurt somebody else, his behavior was his to decide what it was going to be, and not that of the government. And the idea that through all kinds of modifications are all kinds of incentives or disincentives in the tax code, the government can control the behavior of the public, is really anathema to the whole American experiment. I also think it leads very much to the problems that we have with our tax code, that it becomes ever more complicated and cumbersome because no longer is the tax code simply meant to pay the government's bills, but again, it becomes this tool for social engineering. So different interest groups can say, well, you want to encourage this behavior or discourage that behavior, so tax it more or tax it less. Where if we stuck to the idea that taxation is to pay the government's bills, it would simplify. I don't think the tax code will ever be really simple, but it would certainly simplify it more than it is now, when the government uses it as a club to control the citizens' behavior. And this leads me to an interesting quote that I like a lot, that when Dwight D. Eisenhower left the office of president in 1961, he gave what was called his farewell speech. And one of the things that he warned the country against was becoming too beholden to the what he called the military-industrial complex. He is credited, in fact, with coining that phrase. But another thing he warned against that is sometimes missed, especially by my friends who tend to be in favor of the government intervening in the behavior of the citizens. Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "In holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the danger that public policy itself could become the captive of a scientific, technological elite." And I think that is very evident today when we have the scientific profession very, very beholden to the federal government in terms of grants, what gets studied, what types of research will be funded, who will be funded. This is all very, very tied up with the federal government and the agenda of the federal government. And if anybody questions science or scientists, people who call themselves scientists, they are accused of being against science. So I think we have very much this scientific, technological elite in this country that is demanding a greater influence over public policy and is mounting ad hominem attacks against anybody who questions their views. And their views are very often very biased. I mean, most of these people come from elite academic institutions. Most of these people work in a milieu where to get ahead in their departments, their respective departments or their respective fields, they have to be very careful not to tread on toes and not to put out information or do studies or put out data that might conflict with their funders or with the heads of departments or with their institutions. And I don't think nowhere is this greater than in the field of tobacco research, where the federal government's agenda is very, very clear, and whom they give money to, it depends on will those persons, those so-called scientists, will they come up with the data that will support the government's agenda. And we see this over and over again, whereby even the grants that are the grant proposals or the rules for grant proposals almost clearly stipulates that who is ever taking this money has got to come up with something that will forward the government's agenda. So, for example, if you come up with a study that puts the kibosh on the whole secondhand smoke thing or the third-hand smoke thing or a lot of the other contentions of the government, you can expect your career to be at a dead end. And also you will be attacked by a lot of people in your profession who don't want, it's like the emperor's clothes. You know, if you start speaking the truth, you're going to be in trouble and you will be called an enemy of science. This way of bludgeoning people into a kind of consensus, I think we see more and more. And I think it's very much tied in with political correctness, the term I don't like very much, but more and more people are having to be very, very careful about everything they say. Now, you can live in some kind of extremely white elite neighborhood and have nothing to do with poor people, nothing to do with minorities. You may be making $1 million a year, live in a gated condominium community, but if you just say the right things and you express you are disconcerted that somebody says the wrong things, and you act sanctimonious enough, then you will meet the criteria of being politically correct. Now, Cambridge Citizens for Smokers' Rights, as we all say, is a smokers' rights organization. And I came upon another, this was something from the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University, some researchers who are probably very leery about how far people in the tobacco control movement are going, and at what point does it become authoritarian or unethical. And this was a report that was done in the American Journal of Public Health in 2006 by two researchers, one by the name of Bayer and the other Stauber. And I quote, "Acts that seek to limit the contexts in which smoking is permitted are different from those that restrict the right to work, to access life or health insurance, or to reside in communities of one's choice." And many things that the anti-smoking movement doing are directly related to, for example, the right to work. I mean, I think the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention under Thomas Frieden, who formerly was the Commissioner of Public Health in New York City and convinced Michael Bloomberg to prohibit smoking in all restaurants and bars and businesses, he is controlling the CDC to encourage employers to look askance at people who smoke, so that not only will these companies not hire smokers and thereby affect their ability to earn a livelihood, but affect their ability to support their families if they have families. So not only is these data coming from the Centers for Disease and Control deliberately designed to encourage employers not to hire and to fire smokers, it's not only to punish smokers, but to punish their families or their dependents. So if this is not pernicious public policy, and something, for example, that Dwight D. Eisenhower warned against, allowing these scientific, technological elites to capture public policy, I don't know what is. And then, of course, perhaps the most egregious example of this is that the architects of the Affordable Care Act have made it so to discourage smokers from being able to even get medical insurance. And this is seen by this scientific technological elite as a legitimate weapon to control the behavior of citizens, and particularly as it relates to tobacco, and in fact only as it relates to tobacco, because they are not using this bludgeon or this weapon for any other purpose. They're certainly not using it for weight control. They're not using it for alcoholism, for opioid addiction, or anything of that nature. They're only using it against tobacco. And I think that is an interesting question. What does tobacco, why is this considered such a threat to the modern society that they have to unleash so many weapons against it and against those people who partake of tobacco? Now, again, to reside in communities of one's choice is, if, for example, banning smoking in public housing and even banning it on the property puts those people who live in public housing who smoke not only in danger, but it really interferes with their daily life. And these weapons that are being used by authoritarian anti-smoking groups and in the government and elsewhere really should be offensive, not just to people who smoke, but to anybody in our society who at all values freedom and values reasonably fair public policy. So I think kind of this all stems back to the warning that Dwight D. Eisenhower made, is not to let public policy be captured by a technological scientific elite who really, especially in the field of public health, just sees the average person as someone to be, not as a human being, but as a statistic to be controlled and influenced, and without any regard for the person's humanhood and what he or she values in life. Now, of course, I don't want this to be taken too far, because I do think public health has a role to play. I think when you have upwards of 1,300 persons overdosing each year in Massachusetts from opiate addiction, and you have people lying in the street in Cambridge who are unable to work because of alcohol addiction and the like, or you have people who are terribly obese and can't even walk hardly. These are things that I do think are a detriment to society. But tobacco use does not prevent a person from fulfilling his duties as a citizen and as a worker. And in fact, as we have noted, or as I have noted, it actually in many ways makes that person more productive. Certainly literature in the 19th and 20th centuries was the handmaiden of tobacco, was the handmaiden of literature. Our greatest writers, our greatest philosophers, many of our greatest scientists, our greatest statesmen, our greatest military leaders, on and on. And these professions and fields, many doctors have been very, very enthusiastic smokers, pipes, cigars. As I've mentioned, Winston Churchill almost single-handedly ran the British war effort, and he, according to the New York Times, is estimated to have smoked 300,000 cigars in his lifetime. And he lived a pretty full life right up into the age of 90, so it certainly didn't seem to shorten his life any. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence that if he had not been such a cigar smoker, he would not have been able to prevail against the non-smoking Adolf Hitler, who was unable to handle the kind of rigors of leadership that Winston Churchill was able to handle. Dwight D. Eisenhower himself was a smoker of 4 packs of cigarettes a day when he was the supreme Allied commander of the Normandy invasion. Now, these are superhuman achievements that were done by men who were lovers of tobacco. And yet now we are turning our back on tobacco, which, of course, we would never have been a nation without tobacco. Thank you all for watching the program. Please tune in next Wednesday, 7 p.m., the Smoking Section with Steve Helfer. Good night.